So I'm very pleased to introduce our first speaker who will be recreating her 5MP, and that's Emily Mitchell from Presbyterian College. Her topic is machine learning and particle physics, and she was mentored, or still is mentored, by, and hopefully will continue to be mentored, by Professor Amit Lath in the Department of Physics and Astronomy. Emily?
I want to start off with a question. How many of you guys have a cell phone in your pocket right now? Well, if you're like 96% of Americans, then you probably do. And next time that you call your mom or take a picture of your favorite celebrity, you can actually thank particle physics. In particle physics, we're trying to study the most fundamental units of our universe. And as we learn more about these, we're able to harness their characteristics and apply them to new technologies like smartphones, laptops, and even MRIs. While these are great byproducts of our studies in particle physics, they aren't the goal in and of themselves. We're attempting to study what makes up everything in our universe at the most fundamental level. And as of right now, we've compiled everything we know into something called the Standard Model. And this Standard Model was completed in 2012 with the discovery of the Higgs boson. Now, this model remains the most accurate representation we have to date. However, there are some discrepancies that it doesn't account for, and that causes us to look beyond this model in search of new physics. So how do we find this new physics? For starters, we collect data from the Large Hadron Collider. This is a place where they smash particles together at really high speeds. Now, unfortunately, the majority of this data is something that we call background data. And this background data is just a term given to data that's representative of elements on the Standard Model that we're not too interested in looking at. However, we believe that new physics is hidden within this background data, and so we need a method of finding it. This is where machine learning comes into play. Machine learning is a form of data analysis that allows computers to make decisions and predictions based off of data that it's seen before. Specifically, we're using unsupervised machine learning in the form of an autoencoder. Now, this autoencoder, it takes in an image and it compresses the image, decompresses it, and then spits out a reconstruction on the other side. During the training process, it learns the best way to reconstruct the data so that the majority of the data is best reconstructed at the end. This means that if we train our autoencoder on 500 images of apples and 1 image of a banana, it learns the best way to reconstruct the apple images, and it doesn't do a great job reconstructing the bananas. So we can think of our background data as like our apples, and this new physics as our bananas. So with that in mind, we know that we're looking for images that have been poorly reconstructed. So we look at this reconstruction by the means of reconstruction error, which is calculated from the difference between the input image and the output image. And what I want you to see here is that there's a separation between the reconstruction of our background data and our signal data. This tells us that our autoencoder did a good job of separating out those apples from those bananas. Now, as we move to more realistic data, as with all things, it's much more complicated. It's not as simple as separating out bananas from apples. It's much more like separating out Fuji apples from Red Delicious. And the important thing I want you to note is that there still remains this separation between our signal and our background, between our Fuji apples and our Red Delicious. And this tells us that our autoencoder is doing its job. It's separating out what we want to find from what we don't want to take our time to look at. As a good summary of how our autoencoder is doing, we can look at this plot down here. As a reminder, we're trying to narrow our focus. We're trying to isolate those images that we're interested in looking at those bananas, while filtering out those apples that we don't want to take our time to look at. And what we found is that even on very realistic data, when we make a cut that removes 90% of that background data, 90% of those apples, we're still left with 17% of those bananas, 17% of that signal that we want to find, which tells us that our autoencoder is pretty good at isolating that signal that we want to find. So in summary, what we found is that this autoencoder is a good tool that we can use for finding new physics. We'd like to continue to improve this model as well as implement with other machine learning methods. And finally, of course, implement on real data. And as we do this, this is where I want to note how important our autoencoder is in comparison to other methods in the past. Historically, we've needed to know what new physics was going to look like before we found it. We found the Higgs boson and the top quark through mathematical predictions that told us what to look for. But since the completion of the Standard Model, we don't know what we're looking for anymore. We don't know what this new physics is going to look like, and our autoencoder has the ability to tell us when we found something that's simply different from everything else we've seen before. And with this in hand, we can continue to look for new physics. Thank you.